Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Hi there, and welcome to the first episode of Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I thought I'd start off this first episode by sharing a little bit about why it is I picked the topic of grief for a podcast. So let me just first start off by saying, I looked up the definition of grief and I just want to share what I found. This is what I found. Grief means intense sorrow. You feel it if something terribly sad happens. Comes from the Latin word gravare, which means heavy. Now, this definition came from vocabulary.com. Now, I have to disagree with part of this definition where it says that it's something terribly sad that happens. Now, why I say that is because I believe that people can experience grief in happy, life-changing moments as well, like getting married, becoming a parent, moving, changing jobs, etc. I believe that grief occurs when there is a big change in our life, a change in maybe even the idea or expectation of what we even thought our life would look like, and it doesn't meet our reality. Now, as an example of how happy moments can still be grief, I'm just going to share, for example, that of marriage. So a marriage brings two people together and two lives that now suddenly merge, and it changes a lot. A lot changes when there's a marriage because now there are things that each party has to leave behind at times in order for this union to occur. For example, maybe somebody has to leave the previous home that they used to live with. They might have lived with their parents and siblings, or even sometimes even moving to another city or country because you've gotten married. Some of the other things that change are also the family dynamics as well as your friendships. Now, just because you're feeling sad or grief because of what has changed doesn't mean that you can't feel joy of what your present looks like, as well as what the idea of the future holds. So I can say that getting married for me and becoming a mom brought immense amounts of joy, but they also brought grief. So there was a different identity that was born, and part of my old identity was gone. And I really, really struggled for many years with that, especially after becoming a mom. And I was just struggling to find the little bits of me that I had left behind, and I really didn't know how to be able to merge them into this new part of my life and my identity as a mom. And I finally found that probably when my kids were about 3 and 4, that I was able to finally kind of weave that in and bring it into that identity as a mom and bring those parts of me. So I've explained a little bit about my interpretation with grief in happy moments, that can happen in happy moments. And now I want to talk a little bit about the grief that comes when someone dies. and my own experience with death and grief. And you'll actually hear a little more into some of those stories as I interview even some of my family members as well through the different podcasts. But I want to just share the reason that I am so passionate about creating this podcast is because I have personally experienced grief in both these happy moments and also, of course, in these life changing moments that happen to be the death of a loved one. And I think it's important that I share a little bit about my beliefs about death because they do play a huge part in how it is that I and even my family members dealt with the process of grief. And I think that as I've coached people in their own grieving process, one of the things that I've realized is that sometimes how we grew up and what we grew up believing about death um, make a huge part in our process of grieving. Uh, because there are times in which the ideas that we grew up with may not match the current ideas we have about grief. And sometimes they do. So, anyhow, just again, I wanted to share a little bit about that. So, I grew up believing that death was not the end of life, but rather a transition. So, this is coming from the Baha'i faith, which is in the core of my beliefs. And here's a quote of the Baha'i writings, which I really love. It says the following. This is a quote by Abdul Baha. To consider that after death of the body, the spirit perishes is like imagining that a bird in a cage will be destroyed if the cage is broken, though the bird has nothing to fear from the destruction of the cage. Our body is like the cage, and the spirit is like the bird. If the cage becomes broken, the bird will continue to exist. Its feelings will be even more powerful, its perceptions greater, and its happiness increased. I just love that imagery. And growing up believing that really made a huge part uh, in how I was able to deal with death later to come. So, again, I just want to just share that these are just my beliefs, but I will be interviewing people with so many different backgrounds and beliefs, and I value all of those beliefs, and I know that you as listeners will be able to identify with the different journeys differently, and you might be able to listen to some perspectives that you might have never thought that you could actually incorporate into your own beliefs as well. So just be open-minded as you listen in the future podcasts and the interviews to all these stories. And maybe some of these things can bring you a sense of comfort. And also just that idea of knowing that somebody else has gone through similar trials that you have gone through or are going through in your life, and that they're still able to live their lives in a rich, meaningful way. So I've had many experiences with death and grief in my life, and I could go into detail on to how each and every one of them had a tremendous effect in my life. But I'm going to be brief and just tell you a couple. And again, I'll go into depth into these in later podcasts. But when I was 21 years old, 1996, my sister passed away in a car accident. She was 18 years old. Now, just the year prior to that, December 20th, 1995, there had been a major airplane, a very, very tragic airplane accident in Cali, Colombia, which is the city that I grew up in. And basically, almost everybody, but maybe three or so people on that plane died. And it so happened that about 8 people that were in that plane were people that I knew. And 3 of them happened to be actually very good friends of mine that had actually graduated with me from from high school just the year before. Um, Now, the reason I mention this is because a lot of times when we see people experience some kind of hardship and we see them maybe navigate it in a way that seems so, how do I say this? Maybe in a way that seems so easy. I don't want to say that in like easy, but let's say easier than maybe we would have imagined us going through it. We may not know really how many other tests and trials and processes of growth they had gone through before they experienced that particular incident. So that's the reason I'm kind of sharing just that my friends had passed away in 1995. My sister, December 1995, um, and my sister passed away December 17th, 1996, and her burial was on December 20th, 1996. So just exactly a year after the death of my friends. And December 20th also happens to be my dad's birthday. And I share that because that is that's a topic that I'll probably talk about in later episodes. Hopefully, I get to interview my dad and share a little bit about what that meant even for him, um, to have buried his daughter on his birthday. But I also did mention that that same 1996, in January of 1996, my grandmother in Colombia passed away. So just a month after my friends died. And I was living in the States, so I was not able to attend my friends' burials or my grandmother's burial either. So that played a part in my way of maybe really having some type of closure because I didn't attend their funerals. And actually, till this day, I have actually not attended their grave sites. I haven't never been to their grave sites in Colombia either. So, anyhow, I just thought I'd share that because those are very, very big, um, big moments in my life that really have been the catalyst of me being so passionate about this topic of grief and about sharing my story with other people and then listening to people's stories and how they've been able um, to go through grief and what are the things in their life that have brought them hope in those processes. So, the other huge thing in my life that also happened, and which is a more recent one, is that on November 7th, 2016, my mom passed away from pancreatic cancer. So that was basically almost 20 years after my sister's passing. And that same year that my mom passed away, at the beginning of the year, my aunt and a cousin had died as well, um, also in Colombia, and my mom was here in the States. So, again, those other 2 funerals that I was not able to attend, um, and on the same year that my mom passed. And these were my mom's sister and her nephew. So, all that in a year. And again, there's been way more things, but I I again just want to share this not for for anybody to feel pity, but rather to really understand why it is I'm so passionate about grief and helping others in the process because I have lived it myself. So, just a little bit about me is that As you heard here a little bit about Colombia, I was born and raised in Colombia, Cali, Colombia, South America. That's where I was raised. My dad's from California. My dad is American to whatever that may be, but from immigrant, a father from Italy, and a mother who was born and raised in the countryside of Illinois, Arcola in Illinois. I believe it's mainly it's mainly cornfields, but my dad grew up in California, and he moved to South America in his late 20s and met my mom. And my mom is from Colombia, and they got married and had 4 children. So I'm the eldest of 4. My sister Zorana, who is the one I mentioned that passed away in 1996, she was 2 years younger than me. And then there's my sister Catherine, who was born 7 years after my sister Zorana, and then our brother Danny, who was born 4 years after Catherine. So that is a little bit of the family dynamic. And as you now know, my mom has now passed, and so has my sister. So now it's my dad, my sister Catherine, and my brother Danny, and myself. And then all of us are married. My dad actually remarried as well. And so that's just a little gist of my upbringing. Now, at the current moment, I am in Dallas. As I mentioned, I'm married. My husband's name is Carlos, and I have 2 kids, Mateo and Mila. And to be honest, I don't even know if our lives would look like, I don't think any of my siblings' lives would look like what they look like now had we not gone through all the different tests and trials that we went through and that experience of grief. And there are so many, many things that we're so grateful for. And of course, especially for our families. And I don't believe any of us would have met the spouses we're married to had we not become the people we are through the growth we went through in our life experiences. So that is just a little bit, and I hope to share a little more about my life in the future. But I am, again, so excited to interview people in these podcasts and have you listen to these incredible journeys and stories, and again feel like you are walking alongside others that have gone through what you've gone through, and that you can see the light at the end of that tunnel. You know, sometimes when we're in the middle of a storm, we don't realize that there will be a rainbow once it is settled. And I know from, again, years of having lived it myself, and from now a few years of working alongside others that have grieved and also volunteering as a grief facilitator, that there are a lot of things that happen in your moment of grieving that bring so much gratitude. So again, welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between. And I can't wait for you to experience this ride with me. Thank you again. Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.